Thank you very much, Ignatius. And I would like to thank you and the other organizers for this very interesting meeting. In the next 10 or so minutes, I will discuss with you a specific issue regarding the acute effect of heat-not-burn versus standard cigarette smoking in smokers, which deals mainly with a series of experiments that we conduct in the Athens Medical School. We know that smoking causes increased and accelerated atherosclerosis with a multitude of mechanisms. E-cigarettes and more recently heat-not-burn cigarettes have rapidly gained popularity among both existing smokers and previous non-smokers, as we specifically for the e-cigarettes was discussed by Dr. Farsalinos. Heat-not-burn cigarettes is a particular product that largely avoids pyrolysis and thus avoids the generation of several related harmful molecules, which are produced in less quantities. However, this is something that warrants further study, and this is part of our endeavor to provide new evidence in order to gauge in a more balanced way the potential for risk reduction for these products. In addition, and in contrast to e-cigarettes, heat-not-burn devices do not vaporize liquid containing flavorings, propylene glycol or vegetable glycerol. And while growing literature demonstrates that e-cigarettes are not as safe as generally believed, or as some people believe, we will have the opportunity to discuss that later in the discussion. On the other hand, little clinical research on new generation heat-not-burn in comparison to tobacco cigarettes has been reported, and this is understandable in view of the fact that these products have been quite recently introduced into consumption. Now, a big problem, and you'll see that this is highlighted in these graphs, that a particular problem with trying to measure the effects of heat-not-burn cigarettes in the cardiovascular system is that, unlikely to causing cancer, this cannot be measured with a specific or a few substances or a few pathways. The generation of atherosclerosis is something that's very complicated. Many pathways are being involved, many substances are being involved, so it is quite difficult in terms of pathophysiological relevance to conduct studies that will give a global and holistic approach. And we need those approaches because the hard endpoint studies are going to be quite late. Maybe we won't have them to the extent that we would hope to have. So we need to target mechanistic pathways, and we need to target specific biomarkers that will serve as intermediate endpoints in order to measure to the full extent or to predict what would the real outcome of the heat-not-burn or other smoking cessation units strategies would offer. So I would, in my presentation, I would deal with the acute effects of heat-not-burn cigarettes regarding circulating biomarkers, blood pressure, which is essentially a biomarker, endothelial dysfunction, and arterial stiffness. Now, this is a fairly recent study that was published and gave evidence on substances that are involved to atherosclerosis progression, or they are involved in arterial thrombosis. There was a comparison. This is a rather complicated table, but I will try to simplify it in a few words. It was shown that in this particular study, heat-not-burn cigarettes and electronic cigarettes were compared to conventional cigarettes, and it was shown that the heat-not-burn cigarettes increase the production of circulating biomarkers. However, compared to baseline, this production was less compared to the standard cigarette, and the heat-not-burn cigarettes in some substances such as NOx and vitamin E had a less production of these products compared to electronic cigarettes. In another study that was done by one of the speakers, Dr. Fasalinos, and I'm sure that we'll have an interesting discussion at the end of these presentations, showed that IQOS emitted far lower levels of potentially harmful carbonyl emissions than a combustible cigarette. But these levels were higher than those that were produced from an e-cigarette. And these carbonyls are involved both in carcinogenesis and in atherosclerosis through interfering with the function of the endothelium. Moving to blood pressure, we published recently a study in a small series of subjects, and a few months later another study was published that showed practically the same results. The results were that regarding blood pressure, there's an acute increase with heat-not-burn cigarettes that is approximately 30% less than those of the conventional cigarette. You can appreciate that at the end of smoking a heat-not-burn cigarette, there's an increase by approximately 12. After the end of conventional cigarette, there's an increase of approximately 12 millimeters of mercury, whereas the increase with the heat-not-burn cigarette is approximately 8 millimeters of mercury. There's a progressive decline, as you can see in the upper left graph. There's a progressive decline that is parallel. Both is parallel in the two. It was parallel in the two arms, in the conventional cigarette and the heat-not-burn cigarette, and it returned to baseline levels 30 minutes after the initiation of smoking of the heat-not-burn cigarette. So, in conclusion, a heat-not-burn cigarette increases blood pressure, but to a lesser degree compared to a conventional cigarette. Now, moving on to specific and more complex biomarkers that might be able to gauge, to measure, to predict the long-term harm that is conveyed by a product. We have to choose among arterial biomarkers, and in this consensus document that we conducted in the European Society of Cardiology a few years back, we said that endothelial function, although it is quite widely used, does not and cannot be used, does not serve and cannot be used as a biomarker that predicts clinical outcome. However, endothelial dysfunction is very helpful in pathophysiological insights and can serve as a very good experimental tool. On the other hand, we proposed arterial stiffness as the prevalent biomarker arterial biomarker that can predict long-term clinical outcomes. And we have supported that in many studies, we and others, in many studies in the literature, and we also showed recently that even pulse wave velocity, which is an arterial stiffness parameter, even if it's not measured but it is even calculated, can predict long-term outcome better than any other parameter, arterial parameter can. And in this particular study that was a secondary analysis of sprint, we got hold of the sprint data and we analyzed the data, and we showed that for a person, in order to achieve the maximum benefit of antihypertensive treatment, they have not only to reduce the blood pressure intensively, but they also have to reduce their arterial stiffness as well. So, having said this background regarding the preponderance of different arterial biomarkers, These are the results regarding the effect of heat-not-burn cigarettes on endothelial function and arterial stiffness, which I'm going to present a bit later. In this experimental study, it was in a study in mouse, in rats. It was shown that IQOS, heat-not-burn cigarettes, produced a rapid and sustained endothelial dysfunction in rats that was comparable to smoking a cigarette. And in this recent study from Italy, it was shown in the left part of the illustration. It is the electronic cigarette effect. In the middle, the conventional cigarette effect, and in the right-hand side of the illustration, we can see the heat-not-burn effect. So you can see the before and after graphs, bar graphs, and you can appreciate that the conventional cigarette in the middle had the highest, more severe deterioration of endothelial dysfunction, whereas the heat-not-burn on the right and the electronic cigarette, they also produced an endothelial dysfunction, which, however, was not different between those two modes of smoking. Moving on to arterial stiffness, a few years back, we and Professor Economidis conducted similar studies that was published in big journals, in which we showed we only showed the results on the acute phase, while Professor Economidis showed also results both on the acute and in the midterm phase. We showed that there was an acute increase in arterial stiffness with electronic cigarettes to a lesser degree compared to a conventional cigarette. However, and continuing this kind of experiments, we showed recently, and we published that there was an increase in carotid femoral pulse wave velocity, which is the most validated index of arterial stiffness, that there is an increase in carotid femoral pulse wave velocity, both with conventional cigarette and with a heat-not-burn cigarette. There was a greater, let's say, waning of the effect of the heat-not-burn cigarette. However, there was a prolonged effect of both types of smoking over the 30-minute follow-up period. Regarding augmentation index, which is an index of central hemodynamics and arterial stiffness is involved, again, there was a significant increase of this particular index, which means that there was an increase in central blood pressures and an increase in arterial stiffness as well. That was quite prolonged and sustained with the conventional cigarette. However, it returned almost to baseline values 30 minutes with the heat-not-burn cigarette. We concluded that, we did not conclude actually, because we did not conduct specific studies for this, but we inferred that mainly the effect is mediated by nicotine and its effect on blood pressure regarding this particular study. So these are my conclusions. We have to conclude that according to our studies and two other studies that have been published in the literature so far, heat-not-burn cigarettes increase blood pressure and arterial stiffness in the short term, and we have to differentiate this short term with the midterm and the long term, because obviously what happens in the short term cannot be directly extrapolated to long-term effects, and this has to be done with caution. On the other hand, users changing from tobacco cigarettes to heat-not-burn products usually increase the smoking sessions during the day, and thus the overall cumulative daily deleterious exposure could be increased. So we have to balance between these two contradictory, let's say, tendencies. So we have to stick with the acute results and try to design further long-term studies that will address this issue. Cardiovascular effects are complicated. and heat-not-burn devices have to be fully examined in clinical studies. This is something that has to be stressed, that has to be emphasized. Of course, we cannot wait for the hard endpoints to be collected. This may take years. In the meantime, these products may be considered as harm reduction strategies. We have to discuss about that, but for sure they're not harmless products, and we cannot wait for the long-term studies regarding hard endpoints. So we have to conduct more and more studies regarding biomarkers, which would serve as intermediate endpoints. And this is my personal opinion that given the predictive role of arterial stiffness, the finding that heat-not-burn cigarettes are negatively impactful on aortic stiffness casts doubt on advocating of smoking heat-not-burn products as a risk reduction among current smokers for the primary and secondary prevention of cardiovascular diseases, at least in the short term. Thank you very much for your attention.